Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. The Nipmuc Nation today is centered at the Hassanamisco Reservation in what is now Grafton, Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of AAS. I'm also joined by Director of Outreach, Kayla Hopper. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome you for the 16th annual Robert C. Barron Lecture, which will be given by Professor James H. Merrell. The Barron Lecture brings a distinguished AAS member who has written a seminal work of history to reflect on the book's impact on scholarship and society in the years since its first appearance. This lecture honors Robert C. Barron, the founder and president of Fulcrum Publishing, who led the American Antiquarian Society as chair of our council from 1993 to 2003. In addition to his accomplishments in publishing, Mr. Barron is a historian, scientist, and author or contributor to 25 books, including Pioneers and Plotters, the American Entrepreneurial Spirit. He was program manager for the Mariner 2, Venus, and Mariner 4, Mars, onboard space computers. In 1971, Mr. Barron founded Prime Computer, which became one of the Fortune 500 largest American companies, and he was its first president and chief executive officer. As chair of the AAS Council, Bob played an important role in sustaining the Society's mission while broadening its audiences and reach. The American Antiquarian Society aims to collect, preserve, and make available the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean before the 20th century. Bob Barron pushed AAS to connect with broader audiences well beyond New England and beyond the world of academic scholarship alone. Among many other achievements, he helped inspire the vision that led to our fellowships for creative artists and writers, initially supported by the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund. So it's only fitting that the lecture named for him was designed to be of interest to the Society's academic and non-academic audiences alike. Before I introduce our Barron lecturer, Kayla will offer a quick overview of the platform we're using for this program. Kayla?
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm just going to give you a few quick notes about how we're going to use the webinar functions. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. We use the Q&A function so that we can better keep track of questions. It also has an upvote function. So if someone posts a question you want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it to help get it to the top of the queue. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program, and we'll keep an eye on them. Due to the large number of attendees tonight, the chat box is only going to be used for informational purposes. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there, and you can contact us as presenters if there's any technical difficulty that we should know about. If you would like to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save a transcription by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. Closed captioning is also available as an option for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC. Finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our website and YouTube channel for viewing later. And that's it. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Kayla. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. When James H. Merrell's book, The Indians' New World, Catawbas and Their Neighbors from European Contact Through the Era of Removal, came out in 1989, Colin Calloway, one of the foremost historians of Native Americans in what's now the United States, wrote in the Journal of American History, his book could be labeled many things: a model of ethnohistory, a tribal history, a community study, a study of frontier politics and diplomacy, a significant contribution to colonial history. The labels matter little. This is just good history. Helen Roundtree wrote in the American Historical Review, one finishes the book feeling almost as though one has done field work among the historical Catawbas. And Theda Perdue, another distinguished scholar in the field, observed that Merrell effectively depicts the Catawbas' adaptability and creativity. No mere pawns, His kitabas are people who had choices and survived by making wise ones. Within certain limits, they shaped their own future. By portraying them in this way, Merrell imparts dignity to the people he studies and sets an example that all scholars of native peoples would be wise to follow. And follow others have. Over the 32 years since the Indians' New World appeared, many scholars have examined the histories and cultures of indigenous peoples in North America, and they owe much to Jim Merrell's insights and methods. The Indians' New World won the Bancroft Prize in 1990, among the most prestigious honors for a book on American history, as well as the Frederick Jackson Turner Award and the Merle Curti Award from the Organization of American Historians. Merrell followed it with Into the American Woods, Negotiations on the Pennsylvania Frontier, which won the Bancroft Prize a decade later. Since 1984, Jim Merrell has taught at Vassar College, where he's the Lucy Maynard Salmon Professor of History. The list of his fellowships is long, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The American Antiquarian Society is honored tonight to welcome Professor Merrell, even if virtually, to reflect on the Indians' New World after 3 decades and to talk about what has changed over the past generation in our view of Native peoples yesterday and today, and what has not. It's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Professor James H. Merrell.
Thank you, Scott. And I want to thank Scott Casper and Kayla Hopper and everyone at AAS who helped to arrange this evening's event. I also want to thank all of you, whoever you are. I don't see you, I just see myself, which is a little bit strange. And wherever you are, I'm grateful to you for taking the time to come, even if virtually. I want to confess something right at the start here. When Scott reached out last winter to ask me to give this year's Barron lecture, I was at once honored and a tad intimidated. The American Antiquarian Society, wow. I don't know if you can see it, but proudly displayed on the wall of my study behind me here is my certificate of election as a fellow of the AAS. This institution is one of the most valuable jewels in the crown of American research centers, and I am delighted to be part of it. Then I took a look at previous year's Barron lecturers, and I went from a tad intimidated to a bit puzzled and even a little bit alarmed. Perusing that list, I felt like Marvelous Marv Throneberry. Do any of you know that name? I think you have to be a certain age, as well as perhaps a baseball fan. Throneberry is not a historian. He was a famously inept first baseman for the New York Mets in their famously inept early years. Later in life, Marvelous Marv, no dummy, made the most of his notoriety by doing TV commercials, including a beer ad that featured a crowd of superstars from various sports, so famous that you would know them by sight. After panning across this herd of sports celebrities, the camera alights on old Marv, who drawls, "I still don't know why they wanted me to do this commercial." I mentioned Marv Throneberry tonight because when I saw the historians who have given this talk before, I heard old Marv's voice in my head. Okay, I might not be in Marvelous Marv's league, but I don't think of myself as in theirs either. The roster includes all-stars like Bernard Balin, John Demos, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Mary Beth Norton, Alan Taylor, the list just goes on. All-stars, heck, these are Hall of Famers. And now tonight, you've got this Minnesota boy, educated at one little obscure college, Lawrence, in Wisconsin. Don't know if anybody's heard of it, besides a couple of people I know who are watching. A fellow who's contentedly spent his career at a slightly larger and somewhat less obscure college, Vassar. Now, I say less obscure. Many of you might have heard of Vassar. But I once gave a lecture at a Southern university best known for its football team, and en route to the lecture room, I saw the poster advertising my talk. It said, Professor James Merrell, Vassar College. I immediately grabbed the poster and brought it home. It's also in my study here. Vassar College, they have resisted my efforts to change the name to that ever since. All of this is by way of saying that I'm honored to be invited and to be with you this evening in spirit and on screen. Which brings me to another, more recent email from Scott when he told me that tonight would be online. We all know why. Disappointing news indeed for me for 2 reasons. First, I wouldn't be able to visit AAS. Second, webinars. I am, as we say at Vassar, technologically challenged. Any machine more sophisticated than a coffee maker is going to defeat me. And if you don't believe me, let me tell you this. I spent more time than I care to admit trying to figure out how to blur the background behind me so that you wouldn't see that besides my AAS diploma, my study is basically a shrine to my hapless hometown baseball team, the Minnesota Twins. You can see for yourself how that turned out. Alas, this is nothing new for me. 20 years ago, talking technology with my son, Dave, who was then about 13, I sighed, "Dave, I just can't figure this stuff out. I guess I'm just a dinosaur." "No, Dad," Dave cried. "No, you're more like a woolly mammoth," he said. "So I'm still extinct. I'm just a little bit hairier." It's a great comfort to know that Scott and his staff are on hand to deal with any glitches that come up for me, and that at this end, my wife, Linda, who's already been the lighting engineer for this study, is on standby downstairs in case of emergency. It's also a pleasure to be with you, barring a tech catastrophe, because it gives me a chance to reflect on the road I've been on since Jimmy Carter was president. This is not the first time I've had that chance. A decade ago, I took a trip down memory lane for the book's 20th anniversary edition, some of which you'll hear tonight. And a while back, Catawba leaders weren't in touch with a question about their past. Just last month, someone from another South Carolina Native people reached out, leading me to venture into a corner of my basement and open up dusty boxes labeled Indians' New World. So I have been back from time to time. I'm told by folks at AAS that self-deprecation is a recurrent theme in the Barron lecture. As you can tell by now, I'm happy to carry on that tradition. I'm proud of the Indians' New World, make no mistake. But speaking of mistakes, it is humbling to return not just to the book, but to the process, the pitfalls and pratfalls of creating it so long ago. Those pratfalls began really even before I started on the path that led to the Indians' New World. For the book's origins lie in a long ago moment of sheer panic. It was the fall of 1977. I just arrived in Baltimore to begin graduate study in early American history with Jack Green at Johns Hopkins. Shortly after finding my way to campus, I learned that the rite of passage for all first-year students was the American Seminar Paper, an article-length research project that each neophyte would, at the end of the first year, present to all the assembled faculty and grad students. "Would you please," Professor Green asked, "come up with a topic in the near future?" "Of course I will," I said. Trudging home that day, I suddenly realized an important fact about American colonial history. I knew precious little about it. And what little I did once know, I'd largely forgotten. Yes, I'd taken a course from Doug Greenberg some years before at Lawrence. And yes, that class and that teacher inspired me to make early America a place where I wanted to spend more time someday. But since then, neither my Lawrence senior thesis nor 2 years studying in England had brought me anywhere near the place. Where in my shallow pool of knowledge, made shallower still by evaporation, was I going to find a topic? Desperate men, desperate measures. I dug out my notes from that colonial America class and began leafing through them, hoping to find there something that would rescue me from having to plead ignorance in my chosen field and perhaps get drummed out of Hopkins before the semester had even gotten underway. In that old notebook, amid the scrawls and the doodles, Jamestown and Plymouth, Anne Hutchinson, Ben Franklin, I began to notice here and there American Indians. One page mentioned John Smith's counterpart, Powhatan. Another, the Puritans' foe, Metacom, King Philip. Others held general, if maddeningly cryptic, assessments. Weren't primitive, I dutifully wrote, just different, without bothering to write down exactly how they differed. At some point, poring over my sophomoric jottings, summoned from memory something else Doug Greenberg had said. We don't know as much about Indians in early America as we should. Eureka! Something. Well, from such callow, cavalier beginnings, I embarked on a foray into the Indian countries in colonial times, a realm that turned out to be so absorbing that I'm on that journey still. My first halting steps took me to a nearby Native group, the Piscataways, for the American Seminar Paper. Having survived that ordeal, I decided for my dissertation to follow the same path farther afield, eventually fetching up in the southern Piedmont among the Catawba peoples. A new world awaited. To repeat, I was singularly ill-equipped to explore that world, in part because I entered it bearing common stereotypes about Native Americans that were prevalent then and I think are also prevalent now. For example, getting no reply to letters that I'd sent to Catawbas about my project, I wandered onto the Catawba Reservation someday with my wife, Linda, and we ended up spending a very pleasant afternoon with a wonderfully welcoming, hospitable family headed by an official of the Catawba Nation. I remember being surprised during the course of the conversation. Why was I surprised? They were speaking with a Southern accent. Well, duh, as we used to say. Of course they had a Southern accent. Catawbas had been speaking English for 100 or 150 years. And they lived in the South for untold centuries before that. What did I expect? I don't know where it came from, but I expected something else. Thus began my lessons in humility and bias, preconceptions and presumptions, lessons that continue to this very day. Looking back to the fumbling formative stages of the Indians' New World, it strikes me now as not just how little I knew about Native Americans before 1850, but how little anyone knew. To be sure, way back in 1953, the anthropologist William Fenton was pointing out needs and opportunities for study of American Indian and white relations to 1830. And in 1971, Robert Burkhofer issued a call for a new Indian history, one that involved putting Indians back into the American pageant and moving Indian actors to the center of the stage. A few people had already responded. Before I stumbled onto the field, pathfinders like Francis Jennings had written important books, and landmark articles by Neil Salisbury, James Axtell, and others in the William and Mary Quarterly heralded the dawn of a new day. Still, even with those pioneers lighting my way, it's fair to say that when I set out, I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't have the foggiest idea how I was going to get there. I did have some stars I steered by, though. One was to uncover the experiences of natives who were not annihilated by war, wiped out by disease, or otherwise driven into oblivion by what Jennings called the invasion of America, but who instead found ways to survive without losing their identity. Another was to try seeing things from Catawba country rather than Charleston or Williamsburg. A third was to read aggressively against the grain of the sources bequeathed to us by the Catawba's colonial conquerors, to squeeze everything I could from what one native called that pen and ink work, along with anthropologists' field work and archaeologists' spade work. While I ambled along this path, another formative element emerged to shape the story. As I wrote in the book's preface, when I tell people about the project, they'd often ask whether this is Indian history or colonial American history. My glib stock answer then was, yes, it is. It started as a defensive measure. I was by no means certain of the correct reply. With time, however, as I heard the same query again and again, I began to think maybe something's wrong, not with my answer, but with the question. It presumed a barrier between Indians and everyone else in early America that my reading of the sources did not turn up. My goal then became to help restore natives to their proper place in our historical consciousness, as I wrote, by considering certain instructive similarities in the lives of all the peoples occupying Eastern North America during the colonial era. Hence, the Indians' New World. Fastening New World to Indians, I wanted to suggest that natives could be included in the formative American experience of adapting to a new world, an experience that peoples coming to these lands from elsewhere, whether by force or by choice, all shared. By declaring that Native Americans too confronted a new world, a profoundly different milieu wrought by colonialism's microbes, trade goods, warfare, land-hungry farmers, I hope to do what Francis Jennings' Invasion of America had done, to sow with the book's very title what I call constructive confusion, unsettling habits of mind, offering a phrase that, as one scholar pondering the title's implications put it, gives rise to thought. It seems to have worked to an extent. After 1989, New World took on something of a life of its own, as the Indians' New World was joined by the Indians' New South, New Worlds for All, Weaving New Worlds, and the Muskogee's Struggle for a New World. Often the book gets paired with Richard White's classic The Middle Ground, which came out in 1991, as a way of thinking about American encounters. Both these books, the historian Nancy Shoemaker wrote, had a tremendous impact in the 1990s as middle grounds and new worlds sprang up all over North America, and even beyond, for some report finding new worlds throughout the Atlantic basin. As Shoemaker suggests, scholars of early America, and especially of natives in that era, have gone in two different directions, and in doing so have advanced well beyond my own work in all sorts of ways. The first group, Juliana Barr, Ned Blackhawk, Pekka Hämäläinen, and others, headed west, adding Caddos, Utes, and Comanches to the familiar American cast of Powhatans, Pequots, and Wampanoags. Putting early America in their title, joining the series Early American Studies, by various means, these scholars announced that they too do early American history. More than that, their books offer what Hämäläinen calls a basic visual reorientation. Starting from the continent's center instead of its eastern fringe, Barr has argued, gets us out of a directional bind of traditional American historiography, an east-west manifest destiny design in which the passage of events, as well as people, flows from east to west, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the East always remains the center of America. It's time, Barr suggested, to redraw the map. To put it another way, if Robert Burkhofer way back when called for moving Indian actors to the center of the stage, the recent work wants to move the stage. It also wants to rewrite the script. Early America looks very different from where these works stand, shedding what they term the formulaic assumptions that make European powers the principal driving force of history, and tends to reduce indigenous actions to mere strategies of subversion or survival. The new scholarship of the West insists that there is more to Indian history than simply chronicling, which is basically what I was trying to do, how native peoples countered and coped with colonial expansion. Meanwhile, as Shoemaker noted, a second intrepid band of scholars rethinking early America went not west, but east onto the sea, taking as its domain that vast Atlantic zone of human activity stretching across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Atlantic history considers connections among far-flung peoples bordering this ocean. Native Americans are among those peoples clamoring on board ship, as among others Drew Lippman's The Saltwater Frontier and Jace Weaver's The Red Atlantic make clear. All of these excursions and more situate the Indians' New World within a very different scholarly landscape than it occupied in 1989. It was then with some trepidation that I returned to the book 40 years after I started it and 30 years after I finished it. Not having opened it in a while, I wasn't sure quite what to expect. How dated does it seem? How many errors, typographical or conceptual, of omission or commission, leap from its pages? How naive, how clueless does my younger self come across? Dated? Check. Errors? Check. Naive and clueless? Yeah, check. Yes, the book still holds up better than I dared to expect, if I do say so myself, for it shares an emphasis on Native agency and creativity, on resistance and resilience. But I also have to say that revisiting the Indians' New World made me think of something Mark Twain said about his first book. Now, anytime I read a Twain quote, I feel like I should be channeling Hal Holbrook, or if you're Cheers fans, Woody Harrelson playing Mark Twain. But here's Mark Twain, without the attempted imitation. When the Lord finished the world, he pronounced it good, Twain wrote. That is what I said about my first work too. But time, I tell you, time takes the confidence out of these incautious early opinions. It is more than likely that he thinks about the world now pretty much as I think about the innocents abroad. The fact is, there's a trifle too much water in both. In that spirit, I'll mention three aspects of my own first work that I wish I could do over and do better. Simplest would be to incorporate more of my findings on Catawba's relations with African Americans, findings that I'd already published elsewhere and for reasons that I honestly cannot remember, largely left out of the book. Harder, but even more illuminating, I think, I should have considered the Catawba experience through the lens of gender. Yes, gender relations and women's roles can be found throughout the book, but studies since have taught me the rewards of doing so much more. Last and decidedly not least, I would redouble the efforts I made then to meet more Catawba people, and would work harder to overcome the obstacles I faced. Too far from the nation, too little time, and at least at the start, too little money. Trained in the archives, not in the field. My hope would have been to learn more about their own views of their past and sharing with them what I had discovered about that past, trying to inform each other in our interpretations. Well, even though Twain's time has indeed made me reconsider some of my incautious early opinions of the book, overall, it's not shaken my faith in the tale I tell. More generally, peering beyond the Indians' New World and casting my eye over the larger realm of early American history back across these decades, I see much to celebrate in how far, to paraphrase Ned Blackhawk, the field has come. Blackhawk proclaimed in 2005, American Indian history changed the study of American history, arguing that nowhere was this more apparent than in the study of early America. Since 2005, the pace of change has only accelerated. Two recent trends are especially worth mentioning. First, more Native people, though still far too few, have entered the academy. Second, early Americanists today, Native and non-Native, are leaving the archives to learn from descendants of the people they are studying, to do, as one article recently put it, scholarship informed by tribal communities. No less heartening for this old timer, there are signs beyond the avalanche of books and articles of what might be called, with apologies to Thomas Hardy, the return of the native. Everywhere you look, these signs are evident. Harvard's Native American Petitions Dataverse, Yale's Indian Papers Project are creating digital collections of documents on Native American history in collaboration with New England's Native peoples. Besides contributing to these ventures, Native nations themselves, like the Wampanoags, have embarked upon language reclamation projects, among many other groups and many other projects, trying to build up their culture and their history and to find out more about their own past. 90 miles west of the AAS in Stockbridge, the Stockbridge-Muncie of Wisconsin, never forgetting their eastern homelands, have recently launched the Mohican History Walking Tour of their old hometown. Closer to home for me, Vassar 2 years ago set up a Native American Advisory Committee, and last spring approved a land acknowledgement that goes beyond the standard acknowledgement, appropriate as that is, to, and I'm quoting here, commit to build and sustain relationships with Native communities, to expand opportunities at Vassar for Native students, as well as Native faculty and other employees, and to collaborate with Native nations to know better the Indigenous people, past and present, who care for this land here in the Mid-Hudson Valley. Closer to home for you, AAS now has an Indigenous Engagement Advisory Committee and has mined its vast collections and mustered its vast expertise to produce Reclaiming Heritage, digitizing early Nipmuc histories from colonial documents. And as those ads on TV are wont to say, that's not all. Let's look a little farther afield, and you find all kinds of things. This year, Cleveland's baseball team said goodbye to its name and its grotesquely grinning mascot. While last year, Washington's NFL franchise finally dropped its offensive nickname. In DC, too, Deb Haaland of Laguna Pueblo is head of the Department of Interior. The Department of Interior. And just 2 weeks ago, Joe Biden became the first president ever to mark Indigenous Peoples Day. Gladdens the heart, doesn't it? Heady stuff. Perhaps a new age, more inclusive, more sensitive to Native perspectives and experiences, past and present. Perhaps a new age has now begun. Or perhaps not. Here's where I swap a smiley face emoji for a frowny face emoji and offer you what my wife Linda calls my curmudgeonly take on things. I prefer grumpy old man, but either one of those works. Let's reverse course, starting at the national scene and then going to the scholarly scene, and take a quick look around at an admittedly eclectic array of sites. Back in my home state of Minnesota, despite ongoing protests led by natives, the Biden administration has not halted construction of the pipeline known as Line 3, which carries 760,000 barrels of tar sands oil every day across the lands and waters of Ojibwe people. COVID has, I need hardly tell all of you, taken a terrible toll on our globe and on our nation. Native Americans are dying at twice the rate of white Americans in this pandemic, twice. Even as we applaud the decisions made, however belatedly, however begrudgingly, by those teams in Washington and Cleveland, fans of the Atlanta Braves and the Kansas City Chiefs still do the tomahawk chop while serenading their team with a faux war chant. Since 2000, those parts of Iraq and Afghanistan deemed dangerous for American troops were labeled Indian country. And while those troops were hunting Osama bin Laden, a government code name for their quarry was Geronimo. Now, at this point, you might well be wondering whether this Merrell fellow has kind of lost it here. He's kind of gone off the rails. Or, as my darling granddaughter Daphne, then 4, said last winter, oh, so gently, when I mistook her toy horse for a cow, Grandpa, I think you must be losing your mind. Now, in my defense, the light was bad and the toy was little, but nonetheless, she had a point. Anyway, oil pipelines, mascots, Geronimo. What does this have to do with early American history in general and the Indians' New World in particular? It's a fair question. What I want to suggest is that for all the wonderful work on Indian histories, scholars have not fashioned a new paradigm that would, by helping us understand the Native and American past, also shape the Native and American present and future. And one of the reasons for that is that the vocabulary historians use to describe the Native American experience, including the very historians putting natives back onto the stage, including, yes, me, that language has not changed enough. Let me start with how we tell America's story. What I called in the Indians' New World, the barrier between Indians and everyone else in early America has not gone the way of the Berlin Wall, which of course came down in 1989, the same year the book came out. But don't take my word for it, grumpy old man that I am. Here's Pekka Hämäläinen. We've been good at foregrounding indigenous peoples and their intentions in the story of early America, he noted, but the alterations have been cosmetic rather than corrective. The broad outlines of the story remain intact. The hard truth is that Indians cannot simply be woven into the existing fabric of American history. It needs to be unraveled, redesigned, and begun anew. Now, I've got the formula for this. I've got the redesign in my head, and if we had enough time tonight, I could share it with all of you. No, I'm lying. I don't have any idea how we might go about this. I'm hoping the wiser heads and better heads than mine will undertake this task, this new synthesis, this true re-envisioning of America's past. And here's another hard truth. Those brave or foolish enough to tackle that formidable task will need language lessons, which brings me to my second point. Decades after Jim Axtell warned about our loaded vocabularies, we are still shackled to language forged by the victors to justify their conquest of America. Terms that demean America's original peoples and distort America's past. Let me offer a few examples of everyday words that are hiding in plain sight that do this work. Take discovery as in the discovery of America. This makes it sound as if until 1492, America's inhabitants were just sitting around waiting to be discovered like some Hollywood starlet of yesteryear. Obviously, those who first peopled this hemisphere had long been discovering unknown lands, thanks very much. That's how by the time Columbus and company showed up, the Americas were inhabited from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego and from sea to shining sea. Discovery puts us on board ship, peering out at shores unknown. The ever-popular New World, in its conventional meaning, still much in use, keeps us there, for it privileges the European's perspective, seniority, and by implication, superiority. We still channel, incredibly to me, Amerigo Vespucci, who announced in 1503 that these new regions, which we found and explored, we may rightly call a new world. Vespucci could rightly call this hemisphere new. To him it was. But the people greeting or fleeing these hairy strangers as they got off the ship, they didn't see it this way. After all, native ancestors have been living here for millennia. Having discovered their new world, European mariners centuries ago then splashed ashore, dried their socks, and had a look round. What did they see? Wilderness, woods, the wilds. Historians too often use the same lexicon, seeing America in ways that made sense only to the coast-hugging interlopers. But this continent's First Nations had another name for it: home. Not for them, Pilgrim leader William Bradford's hideous and desolate wilderness, full of woods and thickets. Indigenous America bore the imprint of human minds, hands, and tools, a landscape that boasted countless villages, along with, as one colonist observed, an immense quantity of Indian fields cleared already by the natives. Thus, from the indigenous point of view, as Francis Jennings put it in 1975, almost 50 years ago, Europeans did not find a wilderness here, they made one. Intimately linked to wilderness is another term we should think twice about. Settled, as in settlers tamed the wilderness. This too can be traced back to the first colonists. Here's Puritan Governor of Massachusetts Bay, John Winthrop. As for the natives in New England, they enclose no land, neither have they any settled habitation. Confining settler and its varietals to colonists makes European thinking normative, denigrating native ways of ordering, settling the land, thereby rendering Indian territories unsettled with all of the unfortunate implications of that default mode. Wilderness. Stuck in this semantic swamp, we scholars end up spouting oxymorons galore like settlers invaded, settlers destroyed, settlers chose to attack, plunder, and kill Indians. Imagine my delight when, after I had written all of this, I went back to the Indians' New World and found Chapter 5, entitled The Settlers' Invasion. I want to stress that I'm among the problem. I'm trying to find a solution, but I'm among those who are part of the problem here. Discovered, New World, wilderness, settler. These are only a few of the words that color or actually discolor our contemporary conversations with and about Native Americans. However illuminating the work by scholars of Native history is, however successfully it's helped usher Indians back to the early American theater, that theater still resounds with words drafted ages ago by people with an agenda, words that have been and can still be weapons. In fact, the vocabulary list can and should be longer. Once we start to pay attention, other terms surface that are interesting. Colonial period endures. I've used it tonight, even though for Native peoples, the colonial period isn't over. Early America. Think about it. Do we call England, France, and Spain in these centuries early Europe? Early America only works because we're using a European chronometer. Okay, I can't see you, but I can guess what some of you are thinking now. Good grief, this guy's been at Vassar, that liberal bastion, way too long. He seems to have appointed himself chief of the PC police. And indeed, some might conclude that all this is pointless, if not pernicious. Nothing more than an exercise in political correctness, that bugbear trotted out whenever anyone wants to dismiss something rather than discuss it. But word watching isn't political correctness. It's merely correctness. It is not correct to call this continent new, Columbus its discoverer, native homelands wilderness, colonists settlers. Nor is it correct to claim that some folks are just too sensitive, that words don't really matter. So I call this the sticks and stones defense. Think about it though. What if we started calling Europeans who came here not settlers, but invaders or illegal immigrants? What if we called what they did here not taming wilderness, but occupation or desecration? What if we replaced Indian removal with ethnic cleansing? Venturing into more recent times, what if the US government hadn't given to Osama bin Laden the codename Geronimo, but that of another freedom fighter from America's past who won fame battling the armies of a distant empire, George Washington? If you're annoyed by this line of questioning, I can understand it, but I can also hope that you appreciate the power of words to wound, to demean, to dismiss. Now, I grant you that going too far down this linguistic path has its perils. It can take us through Alice's looking glass, down the rabbit hole to a wonderland where, for example, the Distinguished Institution of Higher Learning in Evanston, Illinois, has to change its name from Northwestern University to North Middle University, or where my Minnesota homeland is not located in the Midwest, but in the Mideast. I'd argue that the real danger is not adding too many items to the catalog of suspect words, but too few. That said, I must confess from embarrassing personal experience that it's hard to get out of this lexical rut. Habits of mind, like any habit, are very hard to break. But surely we can at least try to break the spell cast by European colonial figures of speech, to find other, better ways of talking about America's past. Who knows? Such word work might even begin, in a small way, to recast the American conversation about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So I'm inviting us all to rewrite American history and to use An overhauled vocabulary. What could be easier? I know this is asking a lot. To use our imaginations, to think of new ways to approach the past. I know it's easier said than done. And thinking about where things stand today and what needs doing, I'm reminded of something Richard White wrote a while back. Writing the history of Native American peoples has become a vastly more complicated, sophisticated, and chastened endeavor than it was only a generation ago. The early goals, White went on, of writing history from the Indian point of view, of making the experience of Native American people central to narratives of American history, these early goals have proved more difficult and tangled than proponents originally thought. Complicated, difficult, tangled. Little did I imagine when I first turned my gaze toward Indian country how apt those words would be, or how agreeable I would find being constantly in that addled state of mind as I tried to figure things out. Chastened, too, comes with the territory. As you've heard tonight, I've actually felt pretty chastened about my work from the get-go. For all the praise and prizes that have come this book's way, I remain acutely aware, as I wrote 30 years ago in the preface, how much silence remains in my attempt to give voice to the Catawba story. Never was that sound of silence more powerful, more deafening than on my last trip to the South Carolina archives, when the book was nearly done. I was making one last trip to see if there were things that I had missed. The place stayed open, bless them, until 9 p.m. As I recall, it was late. It was growing dark outside, and I was alone except for the staff person at the front desk. I happened to come upon a report penned in the fall of 1849 by one Benjamin Massey. South Carolina's governor had dispatched Massey to track down and count Catawbas, who'd been scattered to the winds 9 years earlier when the illegal Treaty of Nation Ford took the last of their homeland. Not knowing where to start, Massey wandered around for a while until someone suggested he look up an elderly Catawba named Nancy George. She knows where everybody is, Massey wrote, because she is the one, according to their custom, that keeps the records of the nation. According to their custom? Keeps the records of the nation? Rereading that line, I sat back. I confess, I think I might have sworn under my breath. I sat back, stunned and a little queasy, feeling a bit as I had at Hopkins when Jack Green told me to come up with a paper topic. I had studied Catawba history for years, yet I'd never had the slightest inkling of this. My mind reeled. What custom? What records? Why Nancy George? What else might she have told Massey about her people and their past had he bothered to ask, and had she been willing to tell him? Eventually, though, as all historians do, I made my peace with the vast realm of silence in the past. I realized that while I might never find out what Nancy George knew, I had indeed brought to light a lot about her people and their remarkable journey across the centuries. Nonetheless, for all the learning and all the effort and all the struggle that went into the Indians' New World, and for all that I've learned since about Native American history, I still believe, as Doug Greenberg put it a couple of light years ago, we don't know as much about Indians in early America as we should. That world beckons to me still. Thanks, everybody. I can hear thunderous applause in my ears.
Well, absolutely.
Or the sound of people snoring. I'm not sure. Maybe both.
I don't think people are snoring. And in fact, we're getting questions from audience members, and please do keep sending those questions. I will simply start offering some of those questions to you, Jim. But first, I want to say thank you for a marvelous discussion of how you started the project. And I love the way you describe the humility and the way in which doing this work in some ways simply reinforces the humility with which you started. David Bergman asks, have you worked with anthropologists to gain a greater sense of how to see from, in quotations, the native's point of view? How have you tried to include the native's voice in your writing?
That is a rich question. And it's another thing that I think I could have done more with. I did have the help of, at Johns Hopkins, of William Sturdivant, a renowned anthropologist who had done work among Southeastern Native peoples and was very well versed. And he helped me a great deal, but a lot of it was trying to as I said, read against the grain, read between the lines of various documents that contained Catawba speeches. There were letters that obviously had not been written in the 1750s, that had not been written by them, but nonetheless apparently had been dictated by them, and they put their marks at the bottom of the letter after their translator and scribe wrote them down. So a lot of it was trying to piece together and trying to see into the darkness and the silence to imagine things as the natives themselves would have seen it. I make no claim to have succeeded in that, but that was certainly the goal, and that's what I was trying to do throughout, is to constantly try and keep my gaze from the Catawba peoples outward rather than from the colonial records inward.
And I want to pick up on what you just said about reading a document against the grain. So for people who in our audience who aren't historians, we often, as historians, use that phrase, reading documents against the grain. What does that look like as a historian?
Next question? No, I'm kidding. You know what? The first time I saw an example of this was in a book by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich called Good Wives. And she was interested in the everyday lives of women in New England. And she talked about rummaging through the dresser or the bureau in somebody's room. Now, she hadn't done that. I don't think she had time travel capabilities, although with her skills, sometimes I wonder. What she had done was she had an estate inventory that listed what was in that room and what was in this particular part of that room. And she found a way. The estate inventory was not in the least bit interested in the everyday lives of these women. But Laurel Ulrich took a look at this and said, I can learn so much about the everyday lives of these women just by the listing of what they had in that bureau, in that cabinet, in that room. And so it's that kind of thing. To give you an example from my own experience, there's a line in a letter written by a colonist in 1759 from the Catawba Nation saying that the Catawbas were unhappy, that they had promised to support Britain in the so-called French and Indian War and had done so. But they had also been promised that while their warriors were away fighting with George Washington and other colonists against the French and their Indian allies, the governor of North Carolina, Arthur Dobbs, would supply them with beef because they wouldn't be able to hunt for venison. And apparently somebody had gotten the public money and then sold them crummy beef. And instead of the finest cow meat, they were getting old bulls. There's a point to this story, believe it or not. And this line in the letter from this guy McClanahan said Hagler, who was the Catawba leader, found out about this, and he cut the cod off one of these bulls and took it tied to his saddle to Salisbury, North Carolina court, and told the court that the government was giving them nothing but old bulls. Now, I have to explain to my students what a cod is. They're not familiar. They think it's a fish. No, I tell them this is what distinguishes a bull from a cow, okay? And he wanted to prove his point. So think of everything that you can get from that. First of all, Hagler was riding a horse. So the Catawbas by this point were well-versed in horsemanship. Secondly, he knew where to go with his complaint. He didn't go to South Carolina. He didn't go to just someplace in North Carolina. He went to the nearest North Carolina town that had a court session, and he knew when that court session was. And when he got there, he didn't say, we poor Indians, you should take pity on us and give us better meat. He didn't even say, you should do this because we're your allies. He said, you taxpayers are getting cheated. That was one line from one letter, but because I spent time just looking at it and gazing upon it, I was raised in the age of Clifford Geertz and Rhys Isaac, where you take one little thing and engage in what they call thick description, hold it up to the light, look at it from all sides, interpret it as much as you can. That's kind of what I think about. My wife, Linda, who always brings me back down to earth when I wax poetic about these things, calls that milking it for all it's worth. But that's basically what it's doing. You're trying to really extract all the meaning that you can out of it. And that one line in a stray letter revealed worlds about how shrewdly the Catawbas understood the colonial world that was enfolding them.
That's a great example. And it's a great example of how what the person writing the letter didn't think about, but that you can gain from that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a question from Carol McCoy, who writes, in reading about the history of West Virginia, there are many discussions of Indian depredations when settlers were massacred. All words, I imagine, that would have challenges today. And Ms. McCoy writes, are there any studies which describe these Native Americans from their point of view?
Sure. I would invite everyone to look up Gnadenhutten in 1782, which was a massacre of Christian Native people by American forces. The problem is, and George Washington said this, Indians don't have any press through which their story can be told. And so the mind insensibly reads all these horror stories and thinks that's the entire story. We have plenty of examples of Native attacks on colonists. We have relatively few of colonist attacks on Native, but they can be found. Gnadenhutten in 1782 is one. Another example that just comes to mind powerfully is a man, and I can't remember the details of this, but after the Revolution, I think a federal agent is riding into, I believe it's a Cherokee village. And all the children, upon seeing this man approaching on horseback, scream and run off into the cornfields. And when he arrives and he gets off his horse and he asks, why was everybody running? And I think the women ran as well. They said, because of the stories that we tell them about the people who come from the East. And so you see hints here of a whole world of conflict that gets too little attention.
Thanks. We have a question from Edward Countryman, a historian. I stopped a reread of Robert Williams' Linking Arms Together for a class next week so I could follow this talk. And once it's up on the AAS site, I'll ask them to stream it. That's great. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts about using the records of treaty conferences to hear Indigenous voices, allowing for all the problems of translations and chicanery?
Yes. Next question. No, that's I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And actually, I edited the Lancaster Treaty of 1744 with Bedford St. Martin's for college classrooms, and wrestled with a lot of these issues. And there's wildly varying views on this. My own view is that I think that my friend Dan Richter agrees with me, as well as William Fenton, that you can extract Native voices from here if you're very, very careful. It helps, and I wrote an article about this in the William Mary Quarterly, where I had multiple scribes writing down what a Native person translated another Native saying. And it's certainly not unfiltered. It's certainly thoroughly revised, but you do get a sense here, and Nancy Shoemaker has talked about this, that there are some pretty brutal and direct criticisms of colonists in some of these treaty accounts, which suggests that the colonists are not just whitewashing everything, that they do feel an obligation to try and get things down as they're taken. The difficulties of translation and transcription, and was the interpreter qualified? Was the scribe sober? Were they paying? The filters are many, but I still believe that treaty minutes can be used to understand the Native view of diplomacy and the Native view of the world that they and the colonists were occupying together.
Thank you. Diana Korzanik asks, please talk about the word Indian. It's used to gather so many different peoples in different geographies.
Yes, I was wondering if somebody might ask that. If we're thinking about words that we should jettison, what about Indian? And I will say that I am using Indian. I think I used it more in the talk than I ordinarily do. I am moving away from it, but I'm not all the way there. Partly because many Native people still use the term Indians in the name of their people. The American Indian Movement, the National Museum of the American Indian, these are all Native organizations or Native-run organizations that have not yet jettisoned it. But it is absolutely correct to say that it is a misnomer. And even if you substitute it, you're substituting one word for hundreds of different peoples and languages and cultures and histories. And it's always very tricky to talk about Native peoples or any group of peoples across a continent or a hemisphere and not overgeneralize. That is absolutely correct. And it's something we always have to be on the alert for.
We have a pair of questions here that I think connect with one another about the role of Indigenous people themselves in telling these histories. David Keene asks, how do you feel about the argument that only a given minority, e.g. Native Americans, should write about that minority? And Maria Day asks, have you taught any students with Indigenous heritage? If so, how do you encourage them to present their very different perspectives on our country's experiences in the past several centuries?
Okay, that's two very good questions. Can you give them to me again?
Sure.
Yes.
One is, how do you feel about the argument that only a given minority, for example, Native Americans, should write about that minority? And the other is about your own experience in teaching. Have you taught students with Indigenous heritage? And if so, how did you encourage them to present their very different perspectives on our country's experiences in the past several years?
Yeah, thank you. Those are good questions. Those are hard questions, and they're delicate questions. And as not a Native person myself, I am obviously self-interested in this, that I've spent my career doing what some people say I should not be doing. My own sense is that everyone should be able to study the past of every people on the planet with respect for those people and their descendants who are there today. My own sense is that Catawbas that I have spoken with since the book came out have been grateful for the work that I've done, even though obviously it's not the same as it would have been if I myself were a Catawba person. So I'm very sympathetic to that. My belief is we should all be doing more Native American history. And if Native Americans are doing it, I would say we need to learn from them. We need to encourage them. We need to fund them and to work alongside them rather than hold ourselves up, as I did too much of in the archives. So I'm sympathetic to that point of view. Obviously, it's not one that I share. I do think that others with non-minority perspectives can bring something to telling the story of the past. On the other one, yes, I have taught Native American students, including last semester, and their views are not always diametrically opposed or dramatically different from what other Vassar students' views are about this, that, or the other topic. They too have been raised, many of them in the American educational system, and so they've been swimming upstream against that system for their whole lives. So they definitely bring a valuable perspective, and their perspective is not only encouraged but honored. But I also feel that some of them have mentioned to me that I don't feel like I should be speaking for the Native people or even for my Native people. And they want to bring their perspective in, but not to simply say, your perspective is wrong because you're not Native, my perspective is right. It becomes a conversation, sometimes a difficult conversation, but always, I think, for everybody, a rewarding one.
Thanks. We have a question from Joe Barron, and this goes back to something you mentioned about how if you were rethinking the Indians' New World today, you might emphasize more than you did the relation between Indigenous people and African Americans. And he asks, what are prominent examples of the rewriting of American history, and do any tackle the African American and Native experience in parallel?
Hi, Joe. Joe and I went to college together at Lawrence.
Welcome.
He may have been in that class with Doug Greenberger, as a matter of fact. We were both history majors. On the question of who is writing this kind of new history, I would point you to the books that Alan Taylor has written, American Colonies, American Revolutions, and American Republics, which attempt to give a continental frame to the story that is told over these centuries. In terms of relations between African Americans and Native Americans, I don't know a lot about telling them in parallel. Most of the stories that I know are talking about them in the intersection of African American and Native American histories. And here, one of my favorites is work by Tia Miles, Tiya Miles, has written very interesting work on this. And there is a whole shelf of studies now on, especially in the South and in what used to be called Indian Territory, of interactions between Native and African Americans, and it's still an issue today. If you look it up, you will find that there is still debate about to what extent are African Americans part of the nation that formerly held them as slaves, for example.
Yeah, and I'll put in a shameless plug. Professor Miles is going to be speaking here at AAS in the spring, so we're looking forward to that. I might also add, as you think about Caribbean history, the work that Vincent Brown has done on Tacky's Revolt, also about the relationship between Indigenous people and Africans.
Yes.
Yeah. Doug Winiarski, fellow historian, says, "Hi, Jim. Loved your talk. Can you speak more about emerging historical methods in Native American and Indigenous studies? Indian's New World, as you mentioned earlier in your talk, is about including, and including is in quotes, Native peoples in traditional narratives of early American history, finding common ground between Native peoples and Euro-Americans. But I wonder whether the more recent generation of scholars are more concerned with or interested in establishing differences between Native peoples and Euro-Americans. What do you think?"
I think Doug's right. Hi, Doug. I think you're right. I do think that there has been a movement away, and Richard White's Middle Ground, which has been incredibly powerful force in our understanding of the field. And there does seem to be now an effort to move things away and to divide rather than to unite the Native experience. And I see that and I understand it. There's a pendulum here. On the one hand, when I came through, ethnohistory was all the rage, and you need a special set of tools, and you went to special conferences, and there was a journal called Ethnohistory, still is. And I found that the kind of work that I wanted to do was much closer to what Peter Wood was doing on African Americans and Rhys Isaac was doing on Virginia culture generally, and other people. And at that time, Native studies were sort of set off deliberately by a barrier, and they had taken that and run with it and done amazing work with this ethnohistorical method. So my aim was to try and get everybody to see, look, we really belong together. But there's no question that there are profound differences both in colonial times and since in the Native experience, and that emphasizing those is a way of finding the balance between common ground and deep division. For example, one difference is in methodology, that if one were working on, I don't know, Puritans, would you feel that you wanted to go and talk to the descendants of the people that you're studying in order to understand? In other words, you wouldn't have that kind of sense of a contemporary resonance and a contemporary understanding of that past that you would necessarily have if you were studying Native history. So I think that there's a lot of validity to the efforts to step back a little bit from, oh, we're all the same and we're all on one journey, to a journey in which maybe they're parallel, like the old two-row wampum belt that was a symbol for at treaties in which Native peoples and European peoples are going to follow a path alongside each other, but those paths are not necessarily going to merge. And I do see that in the field more in the last 10 years or so.
Thanks. I'm going to put two questions together here because they're both about teaching. Charlie Newhall says, "Thank you as a fellow Lawrence grad and a history teacher." And Charlie's question is, what ought we do as teachers to uncover Native history without glorifying Natives rather than humanize them? Or to put it another way, what event or events would you suggest high school history teachers have students dig into? And Bartholomew Sparrow says there are simulation games that have students taking the part of different, in quotes, Indian nations, e.g. Delaware, and different factions of European Americans. Do you have any particular thoughts about how well these work? So questions about teaching Native history.
I would like to hear more about the games, actually, not necessarily tonight, but send me an email. I would love to hear more. I've heard some about these role-playing games some years ago now. And I think there was one with a treaty in the 1750s, perhaps, if my memory is correct, that I see possibilities there. I'd have to look into them to see how it's handled. But I do think that anything you can do to get students talking to each other, to me, is a good thing. And that's true in my own classes as well. Trying to get them to see things in a new way. One way to start would be, if you're teaching early American history, would be to have them investigate the Pocahontas story a little more carefully, or have them investigate the so-called First Thanksgiving a little more carefully, and try and see things in a more rounded way that takes these iconic American moments and looks at them in ways that complicate without glorifying, but complicate the experience that we've all grown up hearing about when we hear about the first Thanksgiving, or when we hear about the story of Pocahontas through Disney or other ones. So I would try and find particular moments that they know about and are interested in, and try and complicate things. One thing I do, and I know this is at the college level, but I think it would work pretty well at a high school level as well. And that is, in my early American class, the first thing that they read is the beginning of the book of Genesis, and then I give them a West African creation story and a Haudenosaunee, an Iroquois creation story. And I have them read all three of those in tandem and try and find similarities and differences among them. And there are all kinds of complications. Obviously, the Genesis is from the King James Bible, 1611. We know it was around. These traditions from West Africa and from Eastern North America, these were collected in the late 19th and 20th century. So we get into the transmission of knowledge and translation and all these kinds of things. It evens the playing field in interesting ways. Many people consider this the word of God. People consider these origin myths or legends or quaint things like that get collected by anthropologists. And then we can talk a little bit about the way knowledge is structured as well.
And Linda Fort, and I'll ask this, and I have one more after that, and then we'll call it a night. Linda Fort takes this question another step. Thank you. As an elementary teacher, this is where I think the foundation should be created. Do you have any ideas on where we elementary teachers should begin to simplify this history for them to appreciate it?
You know, I haven't been to elementary schools very often, but whenever I get invited to elementary schools, I have such a good time. I have to say, I don't think I could do the job that you do, but because it's a tremendously demanding job. But the children there are so excited and so interested, and the hands just go flying up. So it's quite wonderful. And yeah, you do want to figure out a way to use that energy. And here again, I think trying to get them, even at an elementary school level, to be thinking a little bit more about, well, why do we celebrate Thanksgiving? And what do other cultures do for Thanksgiving? And what was the role of Native peoples in this Thanksgiving, to try and play into? Because one of the things I learned meeting Catawbas who had a Southern accent was we grew up with all these notions of Native peoples that we're not even aware that we have until we're brought up short on that. So even if you can talk about that, the other thing that I try and get people to do is to say, you know, a Native person could look like me, or you, Scott, or I don't know, Gwyneth Paltrow, or I don't, where did that name? Oh, I read an article about her new product today somewhere online. In other words, I've had students who were enrolled members of the Cherokee Nation who were blonde and blue-eyed. And to try and get students to get out of the stereotype of Native Americans look a certain way and they sound a certain way, and we got bows and arrows and moccasins, that's what they are, that to see Native Americans as people living in the contemporary world, but who have a different and distinctive past and path through that world. So that would be a way to start, I think, too.
That sounds really
so much of the elementary record is, let's look at bows and arrows, and let's look, I don't know if this is true anymore. It was true back in the day when my boys were little.
Yeah. And the last question, I think, returns in some ways to the point of the Barron lecture itself. And it's from Phil Sinatier, who says, "This evening, I appreciated how you shared a few research memories from the archives when you were writing The Indian's New World. Do you plan to write or speak more about your archival experiences researching Native American history across your career? In other words, a kind of research memoir or intellectual autobiography?"
Short answer, no. Thank you for being interested in that. It honestly had never occurred to me. I'm not sure that it would be of interest to anybody, but perhaps you and me. I don't know, but I'll have to give that some thought. I don't see that in my cards. Mostly it would be a lot of bumbling and stumbling around and saying, oh, this is exciting, or geez, why didn't I know this before? So I'm not sure it would be any more illuminating than what I've offered already tonight, but thank you for that.
Well, and thank you, Jim. It's been an honor to spend the last hour with you as we think about not just your work, but the field of Native American or Indigenous history over these past 40 years. It's, you know, what you've done is not just talk about your own work, but really about some of the challenges that still face the field today. So I'm very grateful, and I think our audiences as well. Thank you so much for delivering this year's Barron Lecture.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks everyone for coming.
And I'd like to encourage everyone to check out our upcoming programs, which are listed on the AAS website. Next Thursday, we have 2 programs. At 2 o'clock, a virtual book talk from our program in the history of the book in American culture with Karina Zeltzman on her recent book, Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th Century America. And at 7 o'clock that same evening, next Thursday, we have a public program called Where Are the Birds? Rediscovering and Restorying the Landscapes of John James Audubon, a conversation between photographer Krista Elric and the historian Greg Nobles. On Monday, December 1st, we're going to host a conversation between the historian Cornelia Dayton and literary scholar, filmmaker, and really institution builder Henry Louis Gates Jr., entitled Rediscovering the Lost Years of John Peters and Phyllis Wheatley Peters. Dr. Dayton has discovered new information about the history of Phyllis Wheatley and her husband. Much more follows in November, including, related to tonight's talk, historians William Hart and David Silverman discussing Professor Hart's book, For the Good of Their Souls, Performing Christianity in 18th Century Mohawk Country. So please do check out the American Antiquarian Society website for details on these and many other programs. Thank you again, Jim Merrell. Thanks to all of you for watching this evening, and have a good night.